Hello again. Great names in modern Catharism. Cathar 163. There are quite a few books, more every year in fact, about Catharism. They mainly rehash, rewrite, to a degree re-edit medieval, the story of medieval or the history of medieval Catharism. And that's good. The more people know about Catharism, the better. And I think that's wonderful. But there's still too few that really talk about Catharism as a philosophy. What's it really, what are they really on about? And what is the real essence of their beliefs? They regard themselves simply as good men, good women. They were given names like the Cathars and the Perfecti. All these were names given by the church as terms of derision. And they stuck and they accepted them. And they were virtually wiped out, as we know, by the Albigensian Crusade. All the knights and lords came from north of Europe and came for a land grab in the south of France, which wasn't France at that time, in the Midi and the Languedoc. And then of course that didn't work, so they finished them off by introducing the Inquisition, which was a nasty piece of terrorism. And in fact the Gestapo was very much modelled on the Inquisition. The Cathars had to wear yellow stars to show they were, yellow crosses to show they were Cathars, and the Gestapo used, the Jews had to use a yellow star, so that was a similar. So there was lots of similarities between one and the other. They both used torture, both highly refined and brutal types of torture, all courtesy of the Inquisition. And they were. The Inquisition was very successful. They eventually wiped out Catharism, medieval Catharism as we knew it, apart from small pockets and here and there. But you can't kill a good idea, a good philosophy, a good ideal, and so it's resurged again. But where did this resurgence come from? And we certainly owe a debt to the people who reushered in Catharism. The standout was no doubt Voltaire, the French critic of church and state. Well, the church and the state were the same at that time. The Catholic Church and the state were combined, and they were above the law. And he criticised a lot of the imbecility of the modern day through his writings, plays. He lived in Friuli. It's near the Swiss border, and in fact if the French authorities were after him, he could go about 50 metres or so, 100 metres, and get into Switzerland and be safe from the French authorities. So it was a convenient place to stay, because they were certainly after him. He was probably an atheist, but he couldn't say that. He knew not to say it, because anyone who did, well, I'll give an example. In Poland there was a Polish count, I won't say his name because there's no way I could pronounce it, who proclaimed that he was an atheist, didn't believe in God. So the church got hold of him, and he was condemned to death, but he had because he spoke against God, he had his tongue torn out by hot pliers, pincers, because he wrote against God. They had his hand roasted slowly over a fire, and later they put an end to him by chopping off his head and burning the body. So that was the punishment if you want to call yourself an atheist. Thankfully, that happens in a few Muslim countries today, which we know about. You can be stoned to death, you can be shot or whatever. So there's quite a few places actually in the world today where you wouldn't want to go around saying that you didn't believe in God, because you'd be meeting your maker very quickly. But that's courtesy of Islam. So Islam's a few hundred years behind the West, because it's only a few hundred years ago that we were doing the same. So that's not in the history of the world. A couple hundred years is nothing. But this is the reason why Voltaire didn't declare himself an atheist, but even though he did die, the church wouldn't allow him a Christian burial anyway. So, but another case, just to illustrate the point, excuse me, of to illustrate the point of the barbarity of the Catholic Church. And this is in the 17th century, 1680. Don't hold me up on the actual date. No, 1766, 18th century. And there was at that time there was a young count. He was title rich, a count, but the family were poor. And Count Labar, a young 16-year-old. And what happened, there was a procession, a religious procession of monks, and they were carrying the Virgin Mary. And he was something like 150 meters, 150 yards away from the procession. But he didn't go down on his bended knees and didn't remove his hat. And also he was, for that crime, and also showing lack of respect, and also was accused of singing irreligious songs or naughty songs. So he was hauled up, and Voltaire did his best to defend the young lad. And the thing was, the church insisted that he be, what was the term? Bravest punishments. I forget the actual term that they use, the official term. But it also meant with him that he was to have his tongue taken out, his hands chopped off, tortured, and then eventually hung and dismembered and buried. So this is pretty horrific. And the church, it was the church, I think Voltaire was reasonably successful in his case, but against the young lad. But the church was successful and insisted on the punishment being carried out. So the church was above the state, but the church at that time in France, Poland, some other countries, was the state. That's why I was so pleased in Australia a couple of years ago when Cardinal George Powell, now I'm not going into his case or whether he was guilty or not guilty of this or that, but he was convicted and put in jail. He was convicted for a number of years, and but he could have been he was a possible candidate to be the Pope of the Catholic Church. He was right up there amongst them, and he was actually in Rome at the time to reorganise the church's finances, which was, and I believe still is, a bit of a muddle. But anyway, the thing was that it just proved that in Australia at least, that the law is above religious beliefs, and that was wonderful. So from that point of view, that's a win for society. But it wasn't like that in France. So Voltaire was the first person to publicly write about the Albigensians, the Cathars, and also the poor men of Lyon, the Waldenses. They were another group, but they were a Christian group. The Cathars weren't a Christian. They weren't a religious group. They weren't trying to or even start a new religion. They just wanted to be themselves, and they regarded themselves just as primitive Christians because they hadn't taken on all the pomp and ceremony and rituals of the church and so forth. So he had his essay in English was the crusade against the people of Languedoc. So this was his essay, and it's very well researched. It's available. You can Google it. It's in Voltaire's writings. I've got a few of Voltaire's books. I don't have heroes, but if I had a hero, he'd certainly be way up there amongst them. So he was the first person who drew the public's attention to the Cathars, and he was a remarkable man in many ways, and the church and the state had a hard time with him because a lot of the aristocracy, like even Catherine the Great of Europe, was an admirer of Voltaire, and so for the Inquisition to grab Voltaire, they'd be upsetting a lot of the very powerful monarchs of Europe, and you don't get much more powerful than Catherine the Great of Russia. But he wrote a history of the world, and which was remarkable because it was the first history of the world that simply was on facts, on economics, on politics, and wasn't written with the basis, with the background or the basis of religion or religious beliefs. Many would say, a lot of people contradict one if one said that he was really the precursor, or one of the main precursors, philosophically, of the French Revolution. And in fact, it was only a few decades after he died, in whenever it was, that we had the French Revolution, because he talked about the rights of man and the sovereignty of the human being. And interestingly enough, later when Napoleon came, because I always wondered, what stopped the Inquisition? And it appeared that Napoleon, as Napoleon conquered the various countries in Europe, the first thing he did was close down, was get stuck amongst the churches, and he instigated the rights of man. That's equality, brotherhood, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he closed down the Inquisition, and when he arrived in Italy, he did the same, and he closed them down. Although I believe the Inquisition is still in the same, still has the same address, although it's called now the Society for the Congregation of the Faith. So Voltaire he was a person of note, and he drew the public's attention, the Europeans' attention to the Cathars, and he just said they were a decent people, a God-fearing people, and it's one of the greatest tragedies of mankind. So that's how he put the crusade against the Cathars. Later, there's another one, Napoleon Parat. Now I will get the guy's date of birth because he was 1809 to 1891, and that's Napoleon Parat, and he was more into the romance of the Cathars, and a French writer, and he wrote more about the aristocracy and the legends and the romance of the time. But he brought again brought the attention of Europe to the Cathars. To follow him was also, a little bit later, was Roche, who's Deodat Roche, 1877 to 1978. That meant he died 101. But he was born in the Ord, and he's most famous for his works on Catharism, and he also started the Society de Souvenir des Études Cathares, the Society for the Memory and the Studies of the Cathars in English. Following him was Maurice Mcgray, and he again is 1877, and he died in 1941. He was a French writer, poet and playwright, and he was a very strong defender of the values of the Occitan Society. He wrote novels, again, about Catharism, again a little bit like Napoleon. He was very much involved in the romance and the legends of the Cathars. But again, this was all bringing Catharism and the Cathar Society, Cathar ideals to the French, because these people wrote in French, of course. We move then to that guy, Otto Rahn. Now there's a very interesting fellow. His book was called The Crusade Against the Grail, because he believed that because of the Grail romances, he believed that the Cathars were actually held the Holy Grail. They were the protectors of the Holy Grail, and he spent a lot of time down there researching and travelling around with Antonin Goodall, who took him around all the various caves, and they worked together. But this was in the 30s, and in 1939 he joined the Nazi Party and joined the SS. But it appears that he may have had Jewish background, so he was under a bit of a cloud. But he wrote The Crusade Against the Grail, and this caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler, and of course he also talked about the treasure of Montsegur, which no one had actually found. And so Himmler organised Otto Rahn to go down and find the Grail and also find the treasure. Well, we know he was unsuccessful at that, because the treasure's never been found to date, and certainly the Holy Grail has not been found. But the Grail, the Cathars apparently did have a cup. I believe it's silver, and 3 pieces, quite heavy. And this cup that they held, because they weren't into sacred relics and rituals, but they did have some, and this was one of theirs. And so that hasn't been found, but that is supposedly one of the reasons for the basis for the Grail. There's another gentleman, there's Antonin Goodall. Now he was a French mystic, and again he's 1877 to 1962, but he was the one, and he spent a lot of time with Otto Rahn, and together researching and looking for artifacts, the treasure, and things to do with Cathars. But his book, and it's a very interesting book, I had the book, so it's certainly a worthwhile read. But that book also captured the attention of many, and it's of course was written in German, but it's been translated into English. The person though the scholar René Nelly, and now he was 1906 to 1982, and he was probably the greatest scholar historically and factually, getting away from just the romances and legends and myths about the Cathars. And it was Dr. Arthur Gurdam, who I'll talk about in a minute, but it was Dr. Arthur Gurdam who would often contact Professor Nelly about various things that he found out with his Dr. Gurdam's journey into Catharism, and the people that he was, the people with that Dr. Gurdam knew, who had information, and he would check to see if this was factual with Professor Nelly. I'll give you one instance, which also I come into in a small way. The Cathars always wore black, but this Miss Mills or Miss Smith that used to have this far memory, and I think it was Miss Mills, but she said the Cathars, once they were persecuted by the Inquisition, as a somewhat of a disguise, they also used to wear dark green long gowns of a dark green colour. And Professor Nelly said, no, that's not correct. But later, as Professor Nelly gained more information, he found out that in fact this was so. So this was from a person, Miss Mills or Miss Smith. If you read Dr. Gurdam, you'll know the people who I'm talking about. And so this was coming from these people who had this memory from before. In my case, I was at my ex-wife's house, and I just sitting down, and my daughter, who was about 12 feet away, and she was standing, and I was talking to her. In fact, one of the few times I talked to her, I was talking to her about guides and Cathars, and I talked about my guide at that time was Breda de Montserrat, and I said she's got these deep piercing blue eyes, long blonde hair, and but I thought that she looked like Miss Mills, because Miss Mills, when she saw her, this Breda de Montserrat appeared, she was an older lady, wrinkled, but these dark piercing eyes. And my daughter said, no, she's not. And she said, she's about, in her 30s, and she's a really beautiful lady, and she's got these deep, beautiful blue eyes and long blonde hair, which went down to her waist, which is the truth, because the Cathar women didn't cut their hair. And she said, and she's wearing dark blue and also dark green gowns. And I said, how do you know that? She said, I can see her standing alongside you. So I've never seen her, but my daughter has. But the point is, again, that my daughter said, and she had no idea, she knew nothing about guides or Cathar guides, I've never discussed it with her, and she said they wore dark blue and dark green. That's just a little aside. But he wrote extensively, and he disseminated his information in French, and read Professor Nelly. So we owe a tremendous amount of a great debt to him, and it was virtually his life. He was a polymath. He was interested in many things, but that was virtually his life's work. And then, of course, we come to this is all happening in France, which is fair enough. Seeing the Catharism, and most of it happened in France, although it was over Europe. But and then we come across to the English side of things, and we have Dr. Arthur Gurdam, I spoke about before, and he was an English psychiatrist. His I noticed when I'm reading that it's obviously English, because in Australia you'd never say what a person's parents were. Who cares what the parents were, the working class, upper class, lower class? there's no class. But when you read anything that's English, it always says middle class or working class or aristocracy. They like to put this little thing in to pigeonhole where they are, and they said that Dr. Gurdam's parents, they were working class, and but he was a pretty bright lad, and he gained a scholarship to Oxford University, and he did very well there. Became a doctor, and then head of an English hospital, and then a psychiatrist, and he wrote quite a lot of things on mental illness and how that you can have a mental illness or other situations that can relate to a past life, and I can say that's true because I've hypnotized a lot of people and taken people through past lives on meditation personally, and I had one woman, and this was 30 years ago, and she stood up, and that night there was about 90, it was a Qantas house, I did 3 nights, and there was about 90 people each time, and but there, after it, I just said, does anyone want to say anything and talk about their experience? I said, I'm only Phyllis, I'm just a facilitator, you're the people who had the experiences and know whether it's a past life or not. This woman stood up and she said, which is pretty brave of her because this is 30 years ago, and she said, I'm a lesbian, this is my partner here, and she said, I tell her I love her, but she never says that, says that to me. But she said, all my life I've had a pain, a sharp pain behind my ear, and it's just there every day, and I just have to live with it. And she said, but when I did that past life, she said, I was a male, and I was on a horse, and I was riding through a forest, and I got hit behind the ear, and there was a really sharp pain with a spear. I was speared, and she died. But her body was, next thing she saw her body in this workingman's hut, and there was her wife and kids, and they was crying their eyes out over her, and she said, well, I never told my wife at that time, or the kids possibly, that I loved them, and they didn't reciprocate with me, but they obviously loved me. So she said, I realise you don't have to say you love you all the time to someone to love them, which I agree with. I love you, I love you, I love you. Don't love me, give me $20. Now, I mean, actions are better than words. So by our actions, we show our love. But the thing was, she said, I don't have that pain behind my ear. Now, only 18 months ago, it's getting close to 2 years ago, this young gentleman, a Muslim friend of mine, and he had pain, and he's had it in his neck, and he said he's been to, I've spoken about this before, but he's been to acupuncturists, physio, specialists, doctors, he's had CAT scans, nothing there. But he said, I've got the pain. And he said, it's there. He's 48 years old. He said, I've had it all my life. And he said, but it drives me crazy, but what can I do? But he said, about the past lives. And he said, you did that. And what's the chance of doing a past life with me and just seeing if that's got anything to do with the pain in my neck? We did. Have half a dozen sessions. But in the last session, this horseman, half a dozen horsemen came up. He was at that time he was a sergeant at arms in charge of a village. He had about 10 people under him. But when the enemy, whoever they were, charged on horseback, they all took off, the villagers and his men. So he was there left fighting on his own, and he was speared in the neck. And the thing was, it took him, he said, 4 hours to die. And he was just so angry because he was just left there to die on his own. He was deserted. But he came out of that, and since that time, now that's getting close to 2 years ago, and that he has not had that pain. So here's another instance of what Dr. Arthur Gurdam was talking about when he was talking about, because he had these experiences and of going back. And another one was Miss Smith or Miss Mills, but one of them had these scar tissue on their back, which had healed, but it was hard scar tissue, but they were blisters from being burnt. And this woman, she was at Montsegur, being burnt at Montsegur, and on the way, one of the soldiers there had a torch, flaming torch, and burnt her on the back there, and she still had that burn some 700 years later. So he had these different instances. So I've had this personal experience myself, how sometimes something that's really happened within a previous life can affect life this way. So Dr. Gurdam wrote about this, and then he discovered his own journey, Cathar journey. He realised who he was. His found memory kicked in, and he was also involved with Beta de Montsegur, who was my guide previously. And he wrote, of course, all those books, Catharism, Reincarnation, We Are One Another, A Foot in Both Worlds, and there's about 4 or 5 books that he put out on Catharism, and then, of course, he lectured extensively on that. His books, Catharism, Reincarnation, they're not an easy read, because for a couple of reasons. One, he just wrote it down as it happened, virtually as from a journal, and of course he was a doctor, and also he didn't want to sensationalise it anyway and make it a good read and a mystery story and all the rest of it. But it doesn't. But if you read it and read his books, it is just so full of information and sayings and things about Cathars and medieval Cathars, and it's his journey, and so that brought the attention of the English-speaking world to modern day, or to Catharism, and today, of course, it's here as a philosophy. It's interesting. Only in the boards. Okay, to follow on from that, there's a Jim Gulliam, I've spoken about him before, and what happened, I talked to him about guides, and suddenly he got a connection with his guide who was honoured in the boards. He's a huge man, and when everyone sees him, these spirit mediums, they go, "Hey, he is huge." And Jim said, you saw him 3 times, he said he's like a French rugby front row forward. He's a big man. But Henri said that Catharism, or Gnostic Catharism, Gnosticism, true Gnosticism, is so remote and so deep that it can never be made into religion. And the other thing is that in Gnosticism, one of the things is that you think for yourself and take charge of your own mind, body and soul. So we're all on different journeys. So you can be a Gnostic and I can be a Gnostic, but we can have totally different journeys, come from totally different areas. You can be a Jewish Gnostic, you can be an Islamic Gnostic, the Sufis, for instance. And you can't put this into a box it in and there's a church, you go to this church. But there's people trying. I see that there's a guy in Spain, there's another guy in America, and they're out to get it as a religion. I keep remembering Hubbard, who kicked off Scientology, and he said one of the wisest, I won't say the wisest, but one of the truest things that he ever uttered was, if you want to make $1 million, start a religion, especially in the United States where you don't pay any tax, and if you're a legitimate religion, you don't pay it in Australia either. But these people that I've mentioned, mainly in France, Voltaire, Professor Nally, Maurice Mcgray, all these people, we owe them a debt. For those of us who are interested in Gnosticism, but specifically in Catharism and modern day Catharism, these are the people who actually put it out there. Now, of course, today we have you can Google Cathars, and there's a whole range of people who come up with telling the story of Catharism. It's mainly historical. I try, if I can, to try and speak a little more about the mystical side, or the essence of Catharism, and that is, unconditional love. And it's so important. Certainly, this one thing that the Cathars is unconditional love for everybody and everything, everywhere. This is the essence, and you don't have to go around shouting it out or whatever. You've got the with that. The reason why unconditional love for everybody and everything, everywhere, is so important is because it totally separates Catharism, the philosophy, the path, the Cathar path, from the religions of the book, the religions of the faith, that is Christianity, Judaism and Islam. Because these religions state you have one life, and on that one life you'll be judged, there'll be a day of judgment, and you're going to go up there or down there. And for eternity, by the way. No time off for good works. So the point is, their God's love is conditional. If you do what I say, the commandments or the Quran or the Torah, if you live your lives according to being a good Christian or a good Jew or a good, you'll go up there, otherwise you'll go down there. Catharism is the opposite. It is unconditional. There's no day of judgment. There's no up there and there's no down there. There's a world of spirit, and we go there, and anyone who's been involved in any way with mediums, spirit mediums, or anyone like that, there's no one burning. His mum and dad, and some of them are good parents and some of them weren't, but they're up there, and there's no punishment, there's no salvation, and there's no damnation. So this unconditional love is so essential. The other factor is that with the deity, that separates Catharism from the religions, the current main religions of the day, is that theirs is a personal God in our image. I don't know what the extraterrestrials think about that, but it's in our image, so it's in our likeness, whether it's male or female or old or young, but it's in our likeness. Whereas to the Cathars, it's a transcendental God. It's a divine energy, whatever. It's actually unknown. We don't know. Only the source, and they refer to it as the source, because the moment you say God, straight away we tend to personalize it. So to keep away from this personalization, it's usually called the source, and it's transcendental. It's beyond our knowing. So there's these two great differences, and religion is great about God and personalizing God and the mother of God and the son of God and the whole family. Whereas on the other side, it's transcendental, it's consciousness, it's supreme intelligence, call it what you like, but it's certainly not a personal God. So these are differences, and it's people. It's these people like the French, the philosophers, Arthur Gurdam, all these people who are trying. This is the message that they're trying to put across, and this is why, again, because of that present day Catharism it's a philosophy, but it's philosophy. It's not for the multitude; it's for the few. Bye for now. Talk soon.